So far at this conference we've been talking quite a lot about how to make machines that think, and quite a lot about the ethics of making machines that think, and how to get ethics, or morality as the case might be, into these thinking machines. So I'm going to turn the tables a bit and actually not so much think about what the machines should be doing, but what we humans should be doing towards the machines. Or perhaps to beings that are moral patients, beings or things in the world that we actually must care about morally. So this is going to be much more about what we should and shouldn't do. And I'm going to dwell to some extent on the plight of software, and especially virtual lab animals, which I think is an interesting case because this is very much here and now. Right now, most of our AGI software is not terribly smart, and our brain emulations are woefully tiny. However, we actually already started to nudge towards some small ethical questions, which are going to probably grow, if we're lucky, into kind of big ethical questions without too long. So the first part of my talk is going to be about those ethical questions we're actually going to have to deal with over the next few years as we pursue our roadmaps towards brain emulation. I'm also going to discuss to some extent the strange effect the brain emulation has on concepts of death, which are morally somewhat relevant. And then I'm going to talk about some of the impact of human level emulations, and we're going to see, of course, how well I managed to manage my time here. But in general, I'm aiming at finally talking a bit about the global impact, which is probably going to shade over into Robin's talk, which is going to be next. But let's get started. I think most of you know pretty well what the idea behind brain emulations is. It's a way of cheating at getting AGI by taking biological brains, scanning them one way or another, turning that scan into something that can be interpreted by a computer, running the interpreted model on a sufficiently large computer, and hopefully getting out behavior, thought, or whatever else is regarded as relevant as going on in a brain. There are, of course, bundles of interesting assumptions going on here, both assumptions about the metaphysics of cognition and mind, but also questions about, well, what can we actually figure out about the brain? What information in the brain is detectable, and how can we actually simulate it? Is it even possible to simulate it? However, I'm not going to dwell too much on the purely technical point. I'm just going to assume that we're going to be advancing towards this goal, and that we're going to be advancing using a fairly normal scientific method. That's going to lead to a few interesting problems. So typically, especially around here in Oxford, a lot of people don't like that we're doing nasty things to the lab animals. And they might even believe in this for quite good reasons. Some of them, of course, go completely overboard about it, but I think most of us would agree that, yeah, we should ideally not use too many lab animals and not use them frivolously. So many people in the animal rights movement say, use simulations instead. That's much better, it's painless, and no real animal needs to have their rights infringed or being harmed by pain or suffering. However, there are a few problems. One obvious problem is, of course, that in order to make brain emulations, we need to understand how brain works. To understand how brain works, typically neuroscientists take mice, rats, and other animals and do stuff to them. Much of this, the same kind of activity that the animal rights people really dislike and think is unethical. There is another problem which is kind of more prevalent as a worry from the side of us who do modeling, and that is, what can we actually learn from an emulation? After all, garbage in, garbage out is very, very true for simulations. And now we're talking about a very complex system that we do not at present fully understand. We hope to understand it, but we know we don't understand it fully. And it has a very large number of degrees of freedom that interact in a very complex and non-linear fashion. If we didn't, we would probably not need lab animals, and we could actually do things with pocket calculators in order to calculate the effects of drugs, etc. So the problem is, developing good emulations that actually tell us something useful is going to be a relatively tough job. This is where it's very important to figure out better ways of actually testing whether what we get from our simulations corresponds to any real biology. And that's in itself a very tough and interesting question. And those of you who were present this morning when Randall presented part of the roadmap know how important part it is of this very complicated project. It's actually a science that needs to be well developed before we can actually get anywhere close to scaling up from very tiny brains into anything that we should be starting to worry about morally. But then, of course, finally, and this is of course where it gets juicy for us who hang around the ethics, is what's the moral weight of an emulation? How much should we care about the suffering of an emulated mouse? Is it like the toy mouse to the right, that if I pinch its tail or throw it around the room, well, that's nothing? Or is it more like the mouse to the left, where if I pinch its tail and throw it around the room, I just done something rather nasty? And people have, of course, given this a lot of different answers. This is a pretty big topic in ethics. People have come to a few bundles of theories of different kinds about why we should care about animals. The first model is the indirect theory. So let's say, actually, animals don't matter morally. They're not persons, they don't have souls, they don't have autonomy, or fill in whatever other big word you happen to like in your philosophical system. So this is Immanuel Kant, and he's arguing that no, animals are not persons, so you can, in principle, do whatever you want to. They're tools. However, for a man who's cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealing with men. Being cruel and nasty makes you a cruel and nasty person. It doesn't matter that it's a non-person you're being cruel against. For that reason, you shouldn't be kicking your dog or burning your cat. Then, of course, other people will say, no, wait a minute, it's not just that. The dog and cat try to get away from the pain. They actually seem to have interests. They actually have some moral standing. They're, of course, not people, but being a person might not necessarily be the relevant part. So here you find various models that look at, for example, at their rationality, not necessarily in the broadest human sense, but their ability to make up some plans, to have some interests. And indeed, they might be experiencing a life and trying to make the best of it. They might not be very intelligent, they might not have much working memory, but they certainly have some rights in virtue of that. So Regan, who is not really a fan of this group of theories, but some even more hardline ones, expresses it rather nicely here. But, well, they have an inherent value of their own because they're experienced subjects of life. And then, of course, we have people who say, no, animals and humans are morally equal. As Ben van Classical has said, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? The point here is, of course, that the suffering, that's the morally relevant thing. Suffering is a bad thing, there should be less of it in the world, and if you cause suffering, well, then you're doing bad. Then, of course, we might discuss what weight to put in here. A lot of the big debate is not necessarily that you shouldn't consider more than animals at all, but rather, well, how much should you do it? How do you weigh them against humans? Which is a separate question and intricate enough. This issue of moral consideration is a bit like a radar screen. Does animals show up on your moral radar screen or not? So these arguments have been argued that yes, indeed, they should be a blip, but whether it's a large blip or a small blip, that depends a bit on other things. So Peter Singer, for example, is also on the moral equality side, have been arguing, for example, that the fact that animals suffer doesn't necessarily mean that in the case of a lifeboat, you should throw the dog overboard, throw a child overboard in order to save a dog. The child might actually have interests that trump the dogs. But that's a situation that is, you need to argue a bit about what those interests are. For example, when it comes to experiments on animals, there are some experiments that might be permissible because they help humanity so much that they're actually worthwhile doing, while there might be other things like, let's say, cosmetics, that no matter that it might amuse and be good for a few people, it's still not worth the suffering they're causing. Finally, there are other theories. So feminists in ethics and some ecologists have also been arguing that there is a relation aspect of this. But moral considerability is actually about a relationship, and well, it might depend on the kind of relationship we're in with these fellow organisms. And this is, of course, going to get rather interesting because when you think about brain emulations. I'm going to allude a bit to later things here, because some of us might want to become brain emulations. So we better care about those virtual animals. If you think brain emulations are not your fellows, you might disregard this argument. Okay. So, can software suffer? And at this point, of course, people's intuition start diverging really severely. And generally you have people on one hand like Searle who argue, no, that simulated lab rat, it's not experienced pleasure of getting simulated food. It's not really even having simulated pleasure. It's just the symbols moving around in a computer that we even, for some reason, interpret as a mouse interacting with food. And similarly, of course, cutting up that virtual dissection, well, it might affect us, but it's certainly nobody there. Other people are not so certain. Dennett, for example, has been arguing that yes, current robots and current software are unable to feel pain. But that doesn't mean we will not always be unable to write software that could feel pain. If we understood enough the functionality going on inside the pain system, we could perhaps create it. Now, I'm not going to argue this very much because we're not going to get settled about it, and people tend to have firm opinions and plenty of arguments about it, but typically it produces more heat than light. The important thing is, of course, that we have divergent intuitions, and I think we can be honest that we actually don't really know whether software could have the consciousness or not, or suffer or not. While some of us believe it very strongly, I think it would be very irrational for us in the face of this big disagreement, unless we happen to have a theory while everybody else were absolutely wrong and you could be absolutely certain about this theory, in which case you should probably also start doubting it, because most such theories historically have also not worked very well. You should give a certain probability that you could be wrong. So if you think that we could get brain emulations, you should think that maybe there is a bit of risk that we're not going to have a perception, any consciousness or suffering. And if you think that we're not going to have it, of course, well, maybe some probability that we might be suffering. So this, of course, leads to a lot of fun stuff. For example, a lot of animal rights people, they are probably motivated to think that, software can't suffer. So they would be pretty eager for us to start cutting up virtual lab rats and doing whatever we want to them. Meanwhile, the transhumanists who look forward to a post-human future might say, wait a minute, we should be careful about those lab rats, because we might actually be suffering if we've done our job well. So here is a kind of practical, short-term thing that I'm suggesting to deal with this uncertainty, and that's why I call it the principle of assuming the most. Well, if you emulate a system, you should assume that it could have the same mental properties as the original system and treat it correspondingly. Now, obviously, if you see some evidence that it absolutely doesn't have those mental properties, in that case, it's all right to treat it differently. But if it actually is an emulation of a mouse, you should probably treat it as a mouse. You're not allowed, morally, by this, to pinch its virtual tail in the virtual reality, to hear its virtual little scream, because there might be actual real pain in there. You might be a bit doubtful about it when you know all the details about the software behind it, but you can't really be certain. This is somewhat similar to a principle Nick proposed in a paper on AI ethics a bit earlier, the substance non-discrimination principle. But this one doesn't make any assumptions that there is the same kind of consciousness in two systems. We don't know what kind of consciousness it is. The only thing we're doing here is making sure that we're not going to accidentally treat something that has moral value, because it could suffer, because it does have some other forms of rationality that morally matters, as it didn't have it. And if you occasionally treat simulacra as having moral rights, well, that's an error I think we can afford to do. It's a bit like lifting your hat when you see a mannequin in a store window. Yes, it's mildly embarrassing when you find out, but it's not a problem. Okay, well, onwards. So what does this imply? Well, a lot of it is very nice, because it actually doesn't change things very much. We should, in our virtual labs, essentially behave like we would be doing with real animals in a real world. So, for example, we should probably not subject our emulations to painful stimuli. And we can actually do this fairly well. After all, the pain system in our emulations is accessible to an enormously good degree, because we can actually turn it off. We can even comment out those neurons. We can completely remove it. Assuming, of course, we know all the relevant systems for suffering, which might, of course, not be entirely true, but at least we can do just a good job as we would be doing in the lab by giving an analgesic to a lab rat before doing a procedure. A bigger problem might be to guaranteeing quality of virtual life for our virtual animals. This is something people have started to realize, that it's not just enough that the rat or dog is not in pain. if it's locked up in a plastic box with no company, that's actually going to be causing suffering too. And of course, what does count as a non-boxy environment is tricky. That's a picture for Second Life. I don't think any of us would want to be locked up in a Second Life world very long. The resolution is too low. It's a crude world that's fairly jerky. It's less clear, of course, how a dog would interpret it, or a rat, or a nematode worm. I think it's pretty likely that we could make an environment that a nematode worm couldn't tell apart from reality. A dog, well, fur simulation is tricky, and how the fur should feel, that's actually a hard question. The most important thing might also be interacting with other animals, because social things are important. And then, of course, there's a question, how do we dispose of our virtual lab animals after we've done experiments on them? And the typical computer thing is, of course, well, delete the current run and start the next one using the backup copy. That would correspond to euthanasia. Normally, this is regarded as a very bad thing when dealing with animals, because there is only a single copy ever of a particular dog or rat or nematode worm. However, here we can restart a new version. What has been lost is essentially those experiences since you started it up. And it might indeed, if it's an advanced animal, have interests stretching beyond that, which are now thwarted, which could be a very bad thing. However, you can also restore it. So in many ways, you can diminish the problem of euthanasia in lab animals by using virtual lab animals. But it also, of course, leads to these weird problems we get, that death gets extremely strange when you exist on a software substrate. So philosophers have actually not just been arguing about what death is, which is a complicated question, but especially about the nasty problem, what's the harm of death? It's a very classic argument going back, for example, to Lucretius, who argued that death is not a problem at all, because when you're alive, well, death is not present. And when you're dead, there is nobody around to worry about. It's fine. You shouldn't worry. So he was at least very happy with that, and people have been debating and arguing this quite a long while. But typically, when any entity dies, they tend to be suffering. That's something we can do quite a lot about, both in the real world and the virtual world. So that's not a problem. It can be separated already. Another thing is, of course, having your experience being stopped. In a software simulation, this is the easiest thing in the world. Just press halt. Stop executing the program. You freeze it, and no subjective time is going to happen for the entity inside. Of course, being stopped means that you're also in a very vulnerable position. It's not only that you're a software running on somebody's computer, but actually things might happen during that time and you don't get a chance to interact with the rest of the world. Then there is, of course, the irreversibility step, which is interesting because that is probably what holds a lot more of the moral weight. However, not every irreversible change of your identity is a bad one. Growing up into an adult is an irreversible change that really changes everything about you. But most of us would say, no, that's not a bad irreversible change. So exactly what kind of changes you need to do irreversibly for it to be bad? Well, that's a bit complicated. And given, as I said, we have backup copies of emulations, we can of course mess with this. We can actually undo certain changes. The loss of identity might be another contender for where the really important moral aspect comes in here. Again, you have a complication because there might be a loss of identity as you take a biological brain and do the scanning, which might very likely be destructive, at least in the early days, in order to create an emulation. That might cause a break in personal identity of the brain. Or it might also be, of course, the problems of identity as you move between different copies or different instantiations of the same one. And finally, we have bodily destruction, which gets really weird because the body destroyed might actually be your virtual body, in which case you just create another one. Or it might be, of course, your original biological body if it's destructive uploading. Or it might be that you're connected to a real biological or robotic body using telepresence, and then that physical body gets destroyed and you find yourself dumped back. Or it might actually be your hardware, in which case you come back from backup. So these forms of bodily destruction suddenly turn completely reversible. As long as there is a backup copy, that's not a problem. However, it might actually be traumatic. In my paper I discuss a bit more, but humans at the very least can actually find violations of the virtual body, even text-based violations, deeply traumatic. That might not be a problem for lab animals, but it might definitely be an interesting problem for humans. So all in all, I don't have the time to get in, but it seems that the sting of death actually gets a bit dulled by this splintering. Instead, we end up with these weird forms of composite depths, where you can have local depths, different copies, and they can return from it. The moral implication of this, I honestly can't say I have explored enough. They're very complicated, and a lot of it depends on the kind of context and what kind of being that is experiencing. If it's humans, well, we tend to complicate a lot for ourselves by thinking about it. In the case of lab animals, it actually seems to make the situation a bit easier doing research. Okay, I've been alluding to human level emulations, and there is a bundle of interesting ethical problems that we're going to have to deal with when we get to this level. But notice that already before that, we're going to have to do some pretty big moral debates. How do we treat, for example, primate brain emulations? Right now, we get stronger and stronger regulations against using primate brains or a living primate in research, because we actually think they're fairly intelligent and are really deserving a lot of moral consideration. So it's one thing to emulate a nematode worm, and well, you don't need much approval for any invertebrate brain for your research. As soon as you move to mice, you better actually follow protocols. When you get to more advanced ones, you might actually find a kind of moat surrounding humanity that we're not morally really, we shouldn't be messing with those kind of animals. Which of course leads to the question whether we could get volunteers to jump over that moat. Well, it worked in mice, and hopefully we can scale it up to humans. That's of course a bit of a safety question. The ethical problem, however, that we've been struggling with, do they have experience? That might actually be easier. We can ask a human emulation. Imagine taking Searle, doing an upload of his brain, putting him in a computer and asking him, so, do you feel conscious? Now, Searle would normally argue that the brain emulation would not be conscious, it would just be a syntactic manipulation of a bit of symbols in a computer. If now Searle in the computer said, wait a minute, I do feel conscious, uh-oh. In that case, we actually have some interesting evidence. It's not proof that he's conscious by any means. It might just be that we managed to successfully emulate the processes going into introspection and changing your mind about profound questions about consciousness and philosophy of mind. Which is still kind of awesome. So it's not a guaranteed proof. He could be a philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie is somebody who behaves as if he was conscious and a normal human, but actually there's nobody at home. And they're very scary because you can't tell whether your neighbor is a philosophical zombie or not. They could be in this room. And the problem is, of course, that we can never really disprove them. I do believe that they're an incoherent notion. It seems weird to think that the zombie philosophers will go to conferences and talk to other zombie philosophers about consciousness when nobody around has ever experienced consciousness. But maybe it's possible that such worlds exist. Even if zombies exist. So we shouldn't forget that there might be people too. Zombies vote. Zombies are going to protest if you say, oh, you don't have consciousness, I'm going to be able to use you as my slave. They're going to say, no way, I want to go on holiday. Yeah, but you're not conscious of your holiday. Does it matter? I feel conscious about my holiday, even if you don't believe me. And now I'm going to call the police, you're crazy. Actually, we're living in a social world, of course, where we're interacting with other entities and figuring out that, yeah, they seem to be like us enough that we start ascribing them a consciousness and hence all those rights that come with it. And I think if we manage to get philosophical zombies around, they would be just as good as we are at convincing others about their moral standing. Yes, we would actually be wrong, but again, it's not a terribly bad thing to be somewhat wrong about it. Except in the long run, of course, when the zombies completely take over. It's actually an interesting long-term problem that if philosophical zombies are possible and they seem to be really nifty and useful to upload yourself, then everybody might eventually do it and nobody's conscious, but nobody minds. Yeah. Okay, I need to probably speed up a bit here. So, the volunteers. Well, as I said, the early days are probably going to have very destructive methods. Which means that if you do this alive, you're essentially going to commit assisted suicide, which is not legal right now. It might change, of course, over decades until we actually can do brain emulation, but it's a weird form of assisted suicide where you're really hoping it's going to fail in a very peculiar way that ends up with a softer version of you. Notice that the volunteers, of course, would be those people who happen to have those weird notions of personal identity that say that, yes, this would be a good continuation of me, or this would be worthwhile. a lot of people would have some body identity theory say, no way, that's not going to be me, I'm not going to volunteer for that crazy experiment. However, enough people seem to be willing to like these notions, so they are actually quite willing to do it. Another fairly likely group is, of course, post-mortem donation. I think a fair number of cryonics people are quite willing to say, oh, don't try to biologically reanimate me after I've been frozen. Just scan my brain and upload me. One of the interesting consequences of this, which, by the way, the cryonics people is much easier, legally speaking, to do this, because we're non-persons. But in both cases, we end up with a successful human brain emulation would actually have spent some time as a non-person. And would most likely, at least the first one, would wake up and everybody would be cheering on and they would be very happy. Although, at that point, he's still a piece of software, probably owned by the research company doing this work. He would not have any legal rights, although perhaps the research team would indeed recognize his moral right. So it's going to be a time before you actually get emulation rights inserted into society. That might be a bit problematic. I don't have much time, but obviously a lot of this research is not going to be perfect, and we're most likely going to generate rights holders that are very badly off and cannot really, well, can we pull the plug on a simulation that is not fully conscious, but partially conscious or in great pain? We can, of course, store them indefinitely, which kind of dulls things a bit, but in many cases, of course, we might never be able to restore a badly done brain scan. We might end up with a situation where we have a lot of brain scans stored. We can't throw them away, but on the other hand, we can't fix them. There are also interesting questions about being able to participate in society. Actually, we might have a right to interact with other people in order to have our human rights. Nick has suggested a principal subjective rate of time, which goes much more further about the right to at least a certain clock speed. There are a lot of very fun legal and practical questions when you can make multiple copies, which also lead to interesting moral problems. Because if I promise something and then I make 2 copies of myself, well, that promise, well, to whom does it apply? It seems like in the forward direction, I might say, I promise you something, and then both my copies should also agree on the promise. However, things can get rather complicated, especially since I might use some forks of myself for rather bad ends. For example, if I want to upgrade myself, I might want to run a genetic algorithm tweaking the parameters of my brain emulation, which means that a lot of little Andersons are generated, tested, and then deleted. So I might kill off 1 billion versions of myself, and I might be completely fine with this idea when I press the go button. After the simulation is done and I found the parameter settings I should go, I'm still happy. Meanwhile, 1 billion Andersons briefly existed and might have suffered quite a lot. How we should count that is an interesting question. There are also issues of vulnerability. If you're software, you can be deleted or edited. And the privacy issues are quite staggering, because the guy who's running the computer can literally look into your brain. I've been working a bit with Peter Eckersley about this, and it seems like software security becomes personal security in the brain emulation world and might be actually very important for maintaining the stability. There are also interesting issues about who owns the data in your scan, especially if you can glean important stuff. If somebody figures out how the Cortex module works to generate, let's say, a general learning ability, that might be worth a lot of money. But you are not a legal person if you're just a brain scan. You might come into existence as the brain scan is interpreted, but you might not have a right to that patent, which is now making trillions. So there are a lot of interesting things going on there, especially, of course, is the ability to make money on this project, at least the latest, are going to be rather important for getting the technology developed in the first place. Okay, global impact. A lot of this is going to be in Robin's and Khan's talk. I'm just going to note that it looks like there are some rather nasty risks surrounding that. The transition to a world with software people might actually create a lot of reasons for conflict. There are no guarantee that there will be a conflict, but there are a lot of reasons to think that, yeah, there could be quite a lot of trouble ahead. There are actually also interesting issues about the arms race we might get, and indeed evolution, for example, to non-conscious states. At the same time, having brain emulation would be a good way of reducing existential risk, because, well, software people would actually not be vulnerable to the same thing as bio people. So if something wiped out one of the groups, the other one might survive. Brain emulation would be great for space colonization. We might get around the AGI safety problem this way. And indeed, there might also be some parts of post-human mind space we can explore by using brain emulation that has so high value states that it's worth taking a lot of risk. So, to end up here, I think the really important part here is that a lot of this might be low probability, high impact issues. And we can do a bit of proactive thinking before that to not end up in trouble and actually make sure people trust our research. So the first thing you should do is just treat our emulations of biological systems as having the same right as the biological system. Thank you. Okay. So, questions?
Thanks for that, and questions. And where's the roving mic on it off to?
Check to see if it's on. Is it on?
Turn it on. Turn it on.
Give it some time. Give it some time. Give it some time.
And now? Yes. First question.
Thanks for a great talk. So I was wondering, in considering the ethical status of simulations, we seem to be asking sort of a question of whether these simulated systems will have the same rights as the originals. But I'm just sort of making the implicit assumption that the rights of these simulated systems are going to be some subset, maybe not a strict subset, but always a subset of the original system. I mean, is it maybe worth challenging this assumption? Because, for example, as you very briefly mentioned, the right to real-time access to allow sort of the interaction of a system with society, it seems to be a fairly different right. And it's not just contained, it's not just a question of talking about do they have the same rights? Maybe these rights might be a superset. Maybe they might just be different with some overlapping. Would you perhaps elaborate on this? Thanks.
I think different without overlap. In that case, you have failed at making an emulation. You have created something different. That's also why I haven't been talking about AGI. I've been thinking over the past few days how much of this carries over to discussions about AGI ethics, and very little of it does, because a lot of it hinges that we can make analogies or say that this is working the same way as systems we think we know a bit about, and we think we know some of the ethical implications of. So the time one is interesting. So if you're, for example, a utilitarian hedonist and think that just pleasure is good, well, if you could have an emulation running a pleasurable state faster than real time, that seems to be a good thing. You should ideally want to maximize the speed of pleasure so you just get more of it in the universe. There's some interesting questions about, of course, a qualitative state, whether you could actually speed it up. But you can easily construct other models like that. But in most cases, it seems like it's just going to be strict subsets. There are very few ones where you get something very different. Of course, stuff changed radically as soon as you start upgrading brains. Once you have a software brain, there are loads of ways you can do interesting enhancement and integrate it with software, which might indeed lead to interesting and ethical things. But I think the conservative position is just to look at in what areas do we actually need to consider that they could have the same rights as we, and that's probably enough. When you can start thinking that they might have more rights, then you probably will be able to observe some qualitatively different behavior from what we normally see.
I imagine uploading will allow a very exotic range of kinds of minds, for instance, hive minds. So how would you measure the, like an ant colony's, a collective effervescent sort of mind that may be a bit more advanced, maybe a colony of uploaded humans? Would that be evaluated more differently than the individuals?
I think different ethical systems as it exists today would be given rather different answers. But typically most of them would just say, oh, we don't know. I think a lot of it is just going to clarify when you actually do start getting the hive mind, the copy clans of the brain emulation. At that point you can actually start investigating what it actually goes into. What kind of autonomy do they exhibit? I don't think we can say anything sensible about it right now. We can base it, of course, on our favorite theory, but I don't think it works that well to extrapolate it.
Thanks for the excellent presentation, Anders. I have two questions, small questions. should a cyber baby, a baby born in silico, have the same rights as an upload? And second, imagine that a prolific author like Ben Gersel releases his Connectome under a free software license. What would the implications be? Thank you.
The cyber baby, I think, is assuming its brain and mind works like a normal organism. Yeah, we shouldn't care where it came from. Again, this is one of the principles in Nick's paper about AGI effects. So that question, I think, has a relatively simple answer as far as we understand it right now. Another question is, of course, what about OpenBen? The OpenBen project and so on. Well, I think in general, a mind, it doesn't matter whether it's kind of open or proprietary, we still need to treat it with a certain amount of respect. So the problem might of course be that Ben has a hard time guaranteeing that all the copies of him are treated with the right respect. However, it might also be good from other perspectives. So again, in the paper I'm writing with Peter Eckersley, we're trying to look at how much open source software is needed to guarantee that you have a good outcome of a transition into a brain image. We're still not down there yet. There are various countervailing factors, but generally we think that it might actually be a good idea to reduce the risk of extreme power concentrations. Now, extreme power concentrations are not always bad. You could imagine that if you had a centralized power that could run the world, it could predict against existential risk. But again, we have plenty of examples of unwise concentration of power too, so that there is no guarantee there. So in the end, I think open sourcing your brain is kind of a brave thing to do, but it's also probably a good guarantee that you're going to be around, at least as a kind of standard example in academic papers at the same time.
Any more questions?
How much funding does Ben need to open source his brain?
Sorry, I didn't quite get it.
Well, the answer is
how much do you have?
More research is needed, in particular about ethics, of course, but also, of course, a lot of computational neuroscience.
Okay, then I think we should thank Anders again for